Hi, everyone. So even if everyone just means Dr. Wood ultimately, but so Isaiah and I will be presenting about high stakes testing in education and all that that entails. So when introducing the subject, we had the idea of asking the question to the class of what their opinion of high stakes testing is before they learned anything from this presentation that they maybe didn't already know before. Just simply based on their own knowledge, what were their thoughts? But then we jump into the definition of high stakes testing, which is any sort of test used in making an important decision. And with us focusing specifically on that aspect that relates to education, this can be for students, for teachers, even for entire school districts sometimes. I left some examples, both related to education, which you'll probably be hearing more about later in the presentation, and some non-education related examples, because you've likely all experienced at least one of these things in your life before, and you probably wouldn't think to label them as high stakes testing then, but there they are, they're in your life, whether you like them or not. School will not for you.
So standardized assessment, and more specifically high stakes testing in American education, has been around pretty much since the beginning and the early development thereof in the early 1800s by Horace Mann, where the first mandated written examinations in reading and writing as well as math were established in the mid 1800s. These were built upon to the late 1800s, and then more formalized assessments were made in the early 1900s, which really began the widespread ubiquity of the high stakes testing that we see in the status quo. So these were really dominated in the early 1900s of the first scholastic aptitude tests, as well as the ACT, which was made shortly afterwards, after the establishment of the College Board. These examinations were made even more widespread after they become computerized, very easy to administer in all areas all across the country. And then these tests were even more so built upon, so very, very commonly established in today's society after the establishment of the No Child Left Behind Act, which required minimum competency testing for schools in certain areas, which requisited that the academic institutions across the United States had to test all of these areas, and high stakes testing followed suit. And then in 2010, Common Core mandates were established in the 6 key areas of reading, writing, and the main school subjects, and then built upon even more so after the Obama administration passed the Every Student Succeeds Act. So we see that in the status quo, following this historical perspective, that high stakes testing has been used for many different determination processes. And the use thereof is really threefold: for students, teachers, and for the school districts. As my colleague mentioned, I'm sure all of us have had experiences with high stakes testing in educational placement tests or minimum competencies as required by the No Child Left Behind Act, as well as like AP examinations, or I'm sure all of us have taken either the SAT or ACT. For teachers, however, in school districts, the tests are really used as a method to sort of operationalize the success of the academic institutions. So they are used as a tool to say, well, this school is getting high scores, they're doing well, we should give them more opportunities to kind of spread their educational prowess, so to speak. Or it can also identify areas that are like, well, this school is not doing as well, the test scores are low, we may need to help them more. So it really implies a reallocation of funding perspective. The role of high stakes testing education is just that, and identifying placement for the students, reallocation of fundings for the teachers and districts, and measuring that success. And the sort of test that follows that logic that's most easily available to put into practice is standardized testing. And this is seen all across the world. Standardized testing is very, very common. It's not just in the United States. It really fulfills the role of educational advancements as well as retentions across the world. And there's, of course, a lot of controversy in the areas where it's most common, such as the United States passing the No Child Left Behind Act. There was certainly a lot of contention when that law was first passed, and a lot of pros and cons that have come out of it.
So when we look at how high stakes testing sort of connects with other aspects of education, my colleague mentioned Common Core, and that has somewhat formed a bit of a cycle with high stakes testing, with Common Core being sort of this baseline for teaching and testing curriculums, but then high stakes testing then has influence of how curriculum then is shaped to the tests that relate to it. If you were to do the chicken and the egg comparison, we know that high stakes testing in general came first because Common Core was only established in 2010, but they still have come to work together and form something of a circle. However, when you just look on Wikipedia, which I wanted to bring up because I thought it was interesting, you'll know that not everywhere in the United States has Common Core standards implemented, and whether or not they do can have a bit of an influence as well, because you know that cycle isn't there, and so operations are going to be working a little bit differently. So as my colleague mentioned, we have the No Child Left Behind Act that generally implemented a lot more testing, but the more recent Every Student Succeeds Act that came in 2015 worked to sort of cut down on those testing with the pretense of encouraging learning and less focusing on the tests specifically, especially when weighing the pros and cons against each other. And currently, what level of testing you'll find is required of a student in any area is really dependent on the district and the state, depending on what educational baselines sort of are implemented.
So even though high stakes testing can provide a host of benefits for the teacher, students, and the districts to identify which schools are struggling and may need more resources, there are certainly a lot of cons associated with the overemphasis of high stakes testing. They are very narrowing in the amount of teachings that teachers are allowed to do. If I would reference Horace Mann, he once eloquently stated, "The best teachers teach from the heart and not from the book." And this certainly translates into the classroom. Most teachers are more successful when they have freedom in the classroom to be able to teach in a manner that they see fit to each individual student. However, these tests really require, especially No Child Left Behind, which still has its minimum competency laws requisited for the school still in the status quo, that there are certain aspects of education that have to be emphasized. And while this can be a good thing, it can also be a bad thing. This encourages and incites teachers to specifically teach to the test, so they are financially as well as academically motivated to seek out those test scores instead of focusing on the child's education. Additionally, an overemphasis of high stakes testing can further disadvantage those with special needs for the examination process, as they are extremely necessary for across the country. A lot of people and administrators of the test will overlook those who have like they're blind or they're deaf or have other visual hearing impairments on the tests themselves. Additionally, a huge con of high stakes testing is that it provokes test anxiety and stress. In reference to a study published at Heisel et al. About 4 years ago, they took disadvantaged students from a intercity school of mostly African-American students in New Orleans in very impoverished and high crime rate neighborhoods, and measured their cortisol levels before and after as well as during a high stakes test, which I believe was a college graduation exam or college entrance exam, actually. And they found that there was an average of a 15 to 35% increase in the levels of cortisol during test taking. So this tells us that students, especially those in disadvantaged areas, are very much so motivated to take these tests because it's necessary for their placement into higher education, which translates ideally into more money for them. So there's a very, as insinuated by the title of the testing, it's very high stakes for them. So this implies a lot of stress associated with them.
Looking at the benefits, though, on the opposite side of high stakes testing, you will find that there are a certain amount of standards set in place that show the good that can also come out of this. High stakes testing is more likely to be externally administered, not solely by the school organization by itself, which not only reduces chances of cheating, but also reduces blowing test scores out of proportion when reporting it. As my colleague mentioned earlier, with how teachers and districts can be financially motivated, they're still having that, keeping them honest while they're doing it. The knowledge of the stakes alone and knowing that the test is important can incentivize studying and effort with the students. Because they are aware that this test is important and going to impact their future, they're more than likely not going to be skimping on their studying or cramming entirely at the last minute. There's that motivation that can, well, mostly extrinsic, can be intrinsic with people wanting to do well for themselves. High stakes testing also has a tendency with the external administration increasing security and supervision to prevent scandals, which, as I talked about with blowing test scores out of proportion, having that lie exposed would reflect very badly on the district and probably the teachers at large. And having that external or independent administration helps reduce the chances of that. There's also the fact that scores on high stakes tests are more likely to be taken seriously by other organizations and by test takers in general, which would be students. And if you're taking a test seriously, the more likely you are to do well, and the more well you do, then people are going to take notice. So looking at some expert opinions about the pros, cons, and something of the neutral ground there, I found a number of studies that talked about people from different areas giving different opinions. On the more positive side, we had Mike Haken, who is the director of learning support for the Seattle Academy of whatever that word is, Sciences, back in 2014, who argued in favor of high stakes testing because he believed that rather than being an intelligence test, specifically, it was more a way of simply tracking academic progress through the years, and the hope of it was to find long-term learning plans with schools and parents working together rather than being just a cutoff or purely minimum competency. However, on the other side of things, Lynn Munson, who was the president and executive director of Common Core at the time of this article, argued more about the downsides, saying that the narrowness of high stakes testing tended to push out any other subjects that weren't related specifically to mathematics or language arts, which would push out curriculars and draining creativity while also putting pressure on the students, essentially meaning there would almost feel like there wasn't much to work for. But then on a more neutral ground, we have Hardcore Assessment, which is a branch of a publishing company involved with the distribution of educational and psychological assessment tools. They made an edition of the Stanford Achievement Test and believed that while they thought the test would need to be used as a factor when regarding grade retention or promotion, it was inappropriate to treat that test as the definitive statement and the only word, because it was only one test and it didn't give a full view about students' overall learning experience. The idea was that, yes, it still needs to exist, but it can't have all of this unnecessary power based on only one experience. Then we get into teacher perspectives, which have a lot of research done about them. And during my research, I ended up finding that while there is a lot of information about potential effects on students and their well-being, finding exact perspectives from them is not always the easiest thing to do. And you'll have an easier time finding teacher perspectives. My colleague will share some student perspectives that he found shortly, but I was actually unable to find any, which concerned me for a little bit. One 2012 study that looked into how teachers felt about high stakes testing found that out of a sample of 10,000, not even a third of them believed that such high stakes testing was actually essential to what they were trying to teach. And even less than that, of that 28, believed that such tests were actually any sort of good reflection of the learning, sort of tying back to what Harcourt said about how the test is not definitive. And then another study done a year before was talking about how teachers would possibly be changing their curriculum in accordance with high stakes testing, going along with what my colleague said earlier about teaching to the test more specifically. And while it was found that instructional strategies tended to not change much, the content very much did in accordance to what he was saying, because it was affected by the pressure of the result of high stakes testing, and people began to prioritize that over anything else in the educational experience.
After hearing some perspectives from the teachers, it's also important to keep in mind that the ones who are taking this test have very strong feelings about them. I'm sure that all of us have taken these types of tests before, and I guarantee that not one of you, or me personally at least, have enjoyed taking them. They're not fun, they're long, they're exhausting. They require a huge amount of time investment prior, during, as well as even afterwards, and kind of the mental aftermath of decompressing from the process of just taking the exam, especially if you don't pass. It can be a tremendous shock. So these are some quotes gathered from a study published by Kearns in 2011 that it's fairly anecdotal lines of analysis drawn between several quotes of the study, but really it goes in three main areas: that high stakes testing is perceived as stressful. It can be a detriment to self-identity, which is to say that when a student really enjoys a subject, such as this example here with a kid liking English, and they really find themselves pursuing more independent education in that area, and they find that the tests are telling them the opposite, that they're not good at it, that dampers their self-esteem and makes them reevaluate which values, or maybe even potentially which career path they want to choose. And I'm sure all of us can relate to this last sentiment expressed here in the punitive category, that high stakes testing can be viewed as kind of a punishment, that if I don't pass, I'm going to have to do all this effort again, even though I already studied.
Some closing remarks just to sort of wrap up and summarize what we've been saying. There are benefits to high stakes testing. It's not just a complete waste of our time, because it does measure certain efficacies of educational institutions and can be important for districts at large. And there is valuable information to be held on perhaps funds with underperforming schools, and what that can mean for the security of districts going forward.
There are certainly a lot of benefits of high stakes testing. However, research suggests that if we base too much decision-making and reallocation of funding or placement examination, if we rely far too much on the examination, it comes as a detriment to the students and success across the board, for the teachers who have to teach to the test, and for the districts who have to redesign their entire curriculums based on the tests themselves, which, as my colleague has stated, takes away from potentially extracurricular activities such as performing arts, for example. Ultimately, we should never let student health suffer for budgeting convenience, as I have written here. That is the point blank period of this argument. that high stakes testing is necessary to sort of operationalize the success of these institutions, to have a metric to compare them against each other. But an over-reliance is not good.
So at the end of all of this, we made some more discussion questions based off of how people's opinions would possibly change now that they've heard pretty much both sides of the argument here. Has opinion changed at all? What are some experiences? And how do they think research could proceed from here? These were our questions meant for the class to be discussed, but we will very briefly instead give our thoughts here, and anyone watching can at least have some food for thought. My opinion didn't really change that much after going through and doing all of this research, because I had a kind of iffy thought on it in the first place, and I kind of still feel the same way about it, that I don't love it, and I don't love how it's often pushed as too much of a necessity, and I pretty much just kind of feel the same way, and I now just know people kind of agree with me. With experiences that I can remember, educational, it was always very pressuring, always had me worried and anxious, and I never enjoyed doing it. And for the research, I personally think what we need are more student perspectives. While I don't think there's anything wrong with anecdotal perspectives, as mentioned by my colleague, because that's ultimately what all of these are sort of going to be, coming from personal experiences, the fact that it's currently so limited means that the people most affected by these high stakes tests are not having their voices heard as much as they need to.
Yes, and the last thing I would add is I would certainly echo sentiments expressed by my colleague Kayleigh in all of these areas. But additionally, I think more high stakes testing needs to improve the literature on the exact successes of the measurements of the high stakes tests themselves. Research has suggested that high school grade levels are more predictive of college graduation on time than are the SATs and ACTs, for example. Even though these are very accurate metrics and very criterion predictive of the success in college, there are, however, other measurements of this success. Grade levels in high school really more measure the self-determination and self-regulation habits that students engage in, whereas the scholastic aptitude test, for example, really tests how well a kid can take a test. So we really need more research on, if these are really helpful or not. And I think that's about all we got, right, Kayleigh?
Yeah, we have plenty of sources to look at if you ever want to go fishing through them yourselves. But other than that, that's going to conclude our presentation for today.